Saludos a todos, bienvenidos a la primera edición de las Single Sessions de Teorema. Es un placer poderlos solo participar en esta conferencia con ustedes después de un tiempo. En esta oportunidad tenemos a Naomi Thompson, que es una metafísica de la Universidad de Bristol y ha trabajado mucho eh, sobre grounding o estas relaciones de fundamentación. Y tenemos el placer de tenerla en esta primera sesión de las Single Sessions. Así que sin nada más que agregar, le dejo a Naomi. So, Naomi, please, the Zoom is yours. And yeah.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Pyro. Thanks a lot for having me to talk to you all today. So I've been thinking about grounding for quite a long time now, and more generally about structure in metaphysics. And what I want to talk about today is a way of thinking about grounding, which departs from the orthodox way of thinking about grounding, in various ways. So what I'll do is I'll start off by giving a little bit of an account of what grounding is supposed to be. As I understand it, some of you are familiar with this notion and others less familiar. So I'll just say a little bit about what I'm taking this notion to be. And then I'll talk about the most common way of thinking about grounding, which is a realist account of grounding. Then I will talk a little bit about why you might want to resist this talk of grounding altogether, or in particular, resist a kind of realist account of grounding. And I'll introduce this, what I call third way, which is to think of grounding in this kind of anti-realist way that I mentioned. My way of motivating this is kind of heavily tied up with a particular way of thinking about the notion of metaphysical explanation. So I'll say a bit about that, talk about some ways in which we might develop an anti-realist account of grounding, and then I'll just finish with some remarks about the kind of big picture. So this is going to be at quite a high level of generality because I want to sort of pull a lot of things together. It's kind of, I'm supposed to be sort of writing a book on this stuff, which is as yet pretty unwritten, but I've done a lot of the thinking about it. So I'm going to talk you through the kind of ideas that are going to feed into that work, really. So I hope that's all right. Okay, so it's not going to let me change slides now. Here we go. Okay, so let's start with this question about what is this notion of grounding. So I think a nice way to think about grounding is as something like a kind of metaphysical causation. So we often think of causal relations as relating cause and effect. We can think of grounding relations as holding not across time, relating a cause and effect, but rather across something like levels of fundamentality. So we can think of the things that do the grounding as more fundamental than the things that they ground. And importantly, we can think about grounding as accounting for what happens when something holds in virtue of something else, metaphysically speaking. So already we're using this kind of explanatory language. So this kind of in virtue of locution is going to be really important to how we think about grounding, I think. So I said that grounding is closely connected to ideas about fundamentality. Here's a kind of example of that. So suppose that you think that the physical facts fully ground the chemical facts such that we can account for all of the chemical facts, in terms of the physical facts. Then we might say that the physical facts are more fundamental than the chemical facts. And as I just said, we can express this by appeal to grounding. So we've got this idea that we can understand kind of levels of reality, the relation between those levels in terms of grounding. So grounding is usually taken either to back or to be identical to metaphysical explanations. So a metaphysical explanation is supposed to be in some ways like a causal explanation. So just like causal explanations track causal relations in the world, we can explain why the window is broken by explaining that a brick was thrown at it if the brick causes the window to break. Similarly, we can appeal to metaphysical explanations where they're backed by a grounding relation, lots of people think. So suppose that the fact that the ball is scarlet fully grounds the fact that the ball is red. Then we can say that the fact that the ball is scarlet provides a complete metaphysical explanation of the redness of the ball in terms of its scarletness. So we can give explanations that are backed by the obtaining of these grounding relations. Or alternatively, we can just think of grounding as itself a kind of explanatory notion. And those are kind of two contrasting views that you find in the literature. Okay, so let me give you a few more putative examples of grounding. So maybe you want to resist some of these examples, but just to kind of get clear on the kind of thing we're talking about. So we might say that the existence of the table is grounded in the existence and perhaps the arrangements of its atoms, the atoms that we might think of as composing the table. We might say that the fact that two people are married is grounded in the fact that they made some vows and signed a piece of paper. We might say, as we've just seen, that the redness of the ball is grounded in its scarletness. Or if we think for a moment about logical grounding, we might say that some disjunction P or Q is grounded in its true disjunct, let's say P. We might say that the fact that singleton Socrates, the set with Socrates as its sole member, exists, is grounded in the fact that Socrates exists. So you'll notice I'm kind of playing fast and loose here with the kind of things that might be the relata of the grounding relation. That's because some people think that grounding holds only between facts. Other people think that it can hold between entities of various different ontological categories. I'm not really going to take a stand on that today, because I think that what I want to say can be expressed in either way, really. So I'm just going to keep that at a kind of, loose level. It's actually usually most helpful just to talk in terms of grounding between facts, but so that's what I'll mostly do, but I don't intend anything to follow from that. Okay, so the orthodox position when thinking about the nature of grounding and the reality of grounding is to say that there are these relations, they really do structure reality. So they exist, and they exist mind independently. So they exist independently of what anybody might think or say about them. They're just out there in the world. Now, if we think of metaphysical explanation as, in some sense, mind dependent, so this is something that people sometimes think, that explanation is not something that's entirely objective, right? It might depend in part on something to do with us, and I'm going to talk more about that later on. But if you think that explanation has any subjective features, friends of realism about grounding think that those subjective features affect the explanation, but they don't affect the grounding relations. So the grounding relations are out there in the world, but maybe when we give an explanation, a grounding explanation, a metaphysical explanation, there might be some kind of subjective factors that come to play a role. As I said, I'll talk more about that later on. So this view, this realism about grounding, is very much the orthodox view among anybody who thinks that grounding is worth talking about at all. And that is not surprising, right? So people think that the reason that we should talk in terms of grounding is that it plays an important explanatory role. It's useful. We can explain stuff by appeal to grounding. And usually if something plays an important explanatory role, in particular, something like an indispensable explanatory role, then that's usually considered to be a good argument for realism about a thing. So I don't think it's surprising that anyone who's interested in grounding, for the most part, is a realist about it. But I think that there are some reasons to resist that. So there have been various kinds of skeptical worries about grounding that have been put forward in the literature. Some of those I'm not going to talk about now, and those are the kinds of worries that say things like that maybe grounding talk is not intelligible, maybe we can't really make sense of grounding talk at all, maybe there's no distinctive notion here, or that all the work that we might think grounding does is in fact done by other kinds of dependence relations. So I'll say some things about that last position in a while, but I don't think that that's a reason to be skeptical of grounding altogether. But there are some other worries that I think push us away from realism. So two kind of classes of worries, some sort of metaphysical worries and some epistemic worries. So first of all, on the kind of metaphysical side, we might wonder, what kind of thing is this relation that's supposed to be existing out there in the world. And one thing that I think might give us pause is that grounding is supposed to be necessitating, such that once we have the ground, we also have whatever that thing grounds. And that is a sort of necessary connection in nature. And Hume gave us reason to be kind of suspicious of necessary connections in nature. If you find that suspicion motivating, then you might feel kind of worried about grounding in that kind of way as well. So you don't have to buy all of these worries, but if you are suspicious of that, then that might be something to give you pause. Relatedly, lots of people think that grounding is a primitive, like an ontological primitive. And you might think that in general, we should be wary of ontological primitives. We want to commit ourselves to as few things as possible. So the bar, you might think, is quite high for thinking that there are, really grounding relations, because this would be a kind of primitive structuring relation. Another kind of sort of concern that you might have is that grounding feels sort of weird, maybe in the same kind of way that Mackie thought that moral properties had this kind of weird motivational force. Because if you think that grounding is an explanatory relation or is really closely tied to explanation in the way that many people think that it is, then we have something that's both objective and mind independent, but still also explanatory. And if you think that there are, good reasons to think that explanation has subjective features, that might, again, give you reason to be a bit worried about grounding being sort of by its nature explanatory, as lots of people have said that it is. You might be able to get around that class of worries in the way that I suggested before, where you might think of explanation as kind of tracking these mind-independent relations, which is fine, but that might lead you to be more concerned about this other class of worries, a kind of epistemic group of worries about how we could get to know about the grounding relation. So one kind of worry about the epistemology of grounding are these kind of Banasaraf style worries about knowledge in general of causally inaccessible posits. So the thought here is that it doesn't seem as though whether there's grounding between certain things or not could kind of affect our knowledge of those things in the right kind of way. So there are kind of sensitivity and safety concerns, as well as these worries about inaccessible metaphysical relations. And this kind of concern is going to go for worrying about whether there is grounding at all, also for worrying about knowledge of what grounds what, and for worrying about knowledge of the features of grounding. So it's just not clear how we could get to know about these relations if they obtain. Okay. So in order to respond to questions about the epistemology of ground, which people have kind of recently started to recognize as a kind of concern, how we should give an epistemology for grounding. How are we going to do that? One way to answer that question is to say that we get to know about grounding because we know about explanation. So we can think of grounding as inheriting its features from features of explanation, and we can get to know about grounding that way. And I think that's not really going to work. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that this notion of inheritance in general is kind of, I think, poorly understood, not well specified. But even if we set that aside, it seems as though the kind of direction is the wrong way around. So if we think that explanations track grounding relations, then we ought to think that explanation has the features it does because grounding has the features it does. And if our way in is by thinking about explanation, it might be that some of the features of explanation aren't coming from the grounding relation itself, rather they're these kind of subjective constraints on explanation, for example. So, for example, we might think that grounding is asymmetric because we think that explanation is asymmetric, but maybe we think explanation is asymmetric because we know that symmetric explanations are uninformative or something like that. These are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about here. So there are worries, I think, about the epistemology of grounding, and it's not clear to me that there are good answers to those questions about how we could get to know either what grounds what, or what kind of features grounding relations might have, or just more generally, whether there is grounding at all. So kind of classes as skeptical worries both about the epistemology of grounding and about the metaphysics of grounding. Okay, so what can we do if we're worried in these kinds of ways? Well, one thing we might do is just to reject talk of grounding altogether. Okay, we could just say, okay, yeah, I am worried about the metaphysics and the epistemology of grounding, so maybe this was a mistake. We should just go back to talking in terms of reduction and give up on grounding altogether. That's one option. But I do think that threatens to make us worse off in some ways. So it does seem to me as though grounding talk does some useful work, and it does useful work of various kinds. So I think it helps us to simplify and to systematize various debates. It helps us to frame things in helpful ways, and in some cases to state some arguments more clearly. So you don't have to look very far to find that grounding talk has been applied kind of all over philosophy in loads of different areas of philosophy, and has been applied in ways that do seem at least to make it clear what participants in the debate are arguing about in some cases. Take a dispute like the dispute between dualists and physicalists in the philosophy of mind. We can introduce grounding talk in order to specify a way of thinking about physicalism as, say, the view that mental facts are grounded in physical facts, which helps us to kind of make progress, helps us to get clear on who's arguing what, and allows us to do that at a kind of level of grain, which I think is useful for conducting these kinds of investigations into fundamentality and dependence. More generally and relatedly, grounding talk seems to raise to salience the prospect of thinking about metaphysics in general in terms of fundamentality and dependence. And it seems to me like that's progress. I kind of like that way of thinking about metaphysics. It does seem like dependence is really important. And even if it's not, it's a helpful theory to think about. And even if we end up ultimately rejecting it, we might think that we'll have made some philosophical progress in any case by eliminating an option that we specified carefully. Finally, so I think there are various ways in which we might be worse off if we eliminated all talk of grounding. But let me just finally mention that it seems like grounding talk is semi-technical in the sense that it picks out something that does seem to be salient in like folk understanding of reality, right? So we do have this notion of in virtue of, which seems non-causal. That does seem to be getting at something, right? There's something interesting going on here. And it seems as though it's helpful if we can, develop tools to be able to investigate what it is that's going on. So I don't think that we should give up on grounding talk altogether. I don't think that we should be eliminativists about grounding talk. So where are we now then? Well, this is what motivates the development of, I think, a kind of third way of thinking about grounding, which is this anti-realist alternative that I mentioned at the beginning. So I think that we should reject realism about grounding, which has the problematic metaphysics and the problematic epistemology, but do so without embracing eliminativism. So I think we should accept that grounding talk is useful and at least sometimes well motivated, but we should deny that grounding talk picks out worldly grounding relations. And this would be a way, I hope, of securing the pragmatic benefits of grounding talk, but without the ontological costs. So I think there are various ways that we might develop an anti-realist account of grounding. And I've thought about some of these more than I've thought about others. But here are kind of three main options. So one is to say that grounding relations exist, but rather than being mind-independent, they're in fact mind-dependent relations. Second option is to say that grounding talk is a false but useful fiction, so a kind of fictionalism about grounding. And then the third option is a kind of non-cognitivism about grounding. So grounding talk non-cognitively expresses something like an attitude or a prescription, but that it's not like truth apt talk. Okay, So I'm going to say just a little bit briefly about each of those three options before finishing with this kind of bigger picture stuff. Okay, so what would a kind of view like that says that what would a view look like that says that grounding is mind dependent? So as I said, this would be a view on which grounding relations exist, but they don't exist in the mind dependent world. One way to think of this, I think, would be to say that grounding talk tracks something like conceptual relations. So here's an example. We might say that the fact that the ball is scarlet conceptually contains the fact that the ball is red. So our concept of scarletness kind of entails or includes that of redness as applied to thinking about something like the ball. Similarly, we might say that the existence of singleton Socrates conceptually contains that of Socrates. You can't have the concept of singleton Socrates without that of Socrates. And so this kind of grounding that's happening here is a dependence between our concepts rather than a dependence that's kind of out there in the mind independent world. And I think it's worth highlighting that if we take this seriously, this kind of conceptual containment idea seems really closely related to explanation. So it seems as though if we have this kind of view, then the balls being red is kind of just fully explained by its being scarlet because of the way in which understanding is related to explanation. So it seems like we understand that the ball is red on the basis of its being scarlet because of our competence with these concepts. We understand these relations between our concepts, and that's a kind of explanatory thing. And so that explains the really tight connection between grounding and explanation. But in particular, on this kind of view, the explanation is kind of prior, right? Because the stuff about understanding is like giving rise to the grounding that's happening here, this kind of conceptual mind-dependent grounding. So that's the first alternative. The second one is a kind of fictionalist approach to grounding. So this is something that I've thought about in a bit more detail. And this is a kind of view according to which we might think of grounding talk as strictly and literally false, maybe because, there is no such thing as grounding. So propositions about grounding are false. However, we might think of them as conveying something that's both true and important. So on the view that I've developed, on the fictionalist view that I've developed, what's conveyed when somebody makes a grounding claim like A grounds B, or the fact that A grounds the fact that B, is that the world is in a condition such that the fact that A is metaphysically explanatory with respect to the fact that B. So again, what's going on here is that the explanation is kind of prior to the grounding. The explanation comes first. So a little bit more carefully, I think what happens is that the speaker conveys something about what they take to metaphysically explain what, which is itself determined, I think, by the presence, or at least the assumed presence, of some kind of finer grained dependence relations. So maybe, for example, composition relations, maybe set dependence relations. So there are various kinds of things that we might think can support a metaphysical explanation. But importantly, it's not the case that metaphysical explanations are supported by real worldly grounding. Rather, they're supported by these finer grained dependence relations. So what happens, I think, is that we have these dependence relations in the world, but they don't really, you can't really chain them, right? So they're separate things, but we want to think about generic metaphysical structure such that we can say, that this thing is more fundamental than that thing, even when the relation between them is not the same kind of dependence relation. And in order to do that, we need to give this kind of air of generality. And that's given by the way in which we think of these things as explanatory with respect to one another. And that itself supports the grounding talk, which is, strictly speaking, false, but nevertheless useful because it allows us to do these various things that I mentioned before. So what the fiction does there is to lend an air of objectivity, because we're not just talking about kind of subjective explanation, we're kind of giving this a kind of an air of objectivity, and also this generality, which I think is going to be useful when it comes to doing that work I mentioned before with respect to things like systematizing debates, framing things, talking about the nature of metaphysics. Okay, so that's the fictionalist proposal. So this is something I need to think about more, but the final view I wanted to mention was a kind of non-cognitivist way of thinking about grounding, according to which grounding talk doesn't express propositions at all. Rather, it expresses a non-cognitive attitude. So here's one example, which I think is you know, has some mileage. So you might think that grounding talk expresses a prescription to cease explanatory inquiry. So it tells you to kind of to stop looking for a further explanation of this thing, because that explanation is fully given by whatever the fact is that we say grounds that thing. And some support for this, I think, can be found in the literature. So, for example, Kit Fine, in a paper from 2012, says it's properly implied by the statement of metaphysical ground that there's no stricter or fuller account of that in virtue of which the explanandum holds. If there's a gap between the grounds and what is grounded, then it's not an explanatory gap. So we have this idea here that you just need to stop looking for an explanation once you have the ground. You just don't need anything further to explain the grounded thing. So yeah, I think one way to think about what's going on could be as a prescription to kind of stop looking for a further explanation. And there are some other things that some other kind of non-cognitivist proposals that we might make, but I think I won't go through those now because we're getting close to the end of time. So let me highlight, though, that on each of those three options that I just sketched, there's a really significant role being played by this notion of metaphysical explanation. So grounding talk is made appropriate on each of these three views because of something to do with how one fact or thing is being explained by another fact or thing. So we've reversed the normal order of thinking about these things, such that it's explanation that kind of supports the grounding talk. And as I've sort of hinted at a few times, I think of metaphysical explanation as being subject to various subjective constraints. So I think an explanation can fail either because it kind of fails to represent the world as being in the condition that it's in fact in, or because it fails to meet these subjective constraints, which might include things like pragmatic constraints. So that would be that the explanation is presented in the right kind of language at an appropriate level of complexity. Epistemic constraints, like that the participants in the explanation have appropriate background knowledge and a shared understanding. And also psychological constraints, like that they have the right kinds of concepts and that they're appropriately receptive to receiving the explanation. So the agent plays a key role, I think, in an explanation. Let me just say a tiny bit more about that. So lots of people think that metaphysical explanation really is something objective and mind independent. And that surprises me because I think that explanation is kind of clearly different from information, right? Explanations are not just representations of the world, they are for an agent in a context. And I think that thinking about explanation in this kind of objective way might threaten to be epistemically inaccessible in very much the same way as I said that we might think of grounding as epistemically inaccessible. So that would be, I think, a bad move. I think that the nature of explanation is such that it is subject to these kind of constraints. And one way to see that is to think of understanding as really closely connected to explanation in the sense of something like grasping, right? So to grasp an explanation, to understand an explanation is to have this kind of subjective feeling of grasping, which you just won't get if, for example, the explanation that's offered is too complex for you to understand. Okay, so I think that if you are presented with an explanation that's too complex for you to understand, this thing hasn't been explained to you, right? In order for it to be explained to you, for it to count as an explanation, you need to be at least capable of understanding it. In fact, I think you have to understand it, but that's even more controversial. Okay, so let me just end with a couple of remarks about the kind of big picture here. So I think that there are different routes to anti-realism about grounding. Some of them I've thought about more than others, but I think that they have in common this idea that grounding talk is supported by metaphysical explanation, and that metaphysical explanation is to be understood as subjectively constrained. So in some ways, this amounts to a kind of double anti-realism, because my claim here is that there isn't really any grounding in the sense of this kind of objectively existing mind-independent relation. But I also think that we should be anti-realist about the kind of explanations that give rise to grounding talk and that allow us to continue to talk in terms of grounding, even though there isn't in fact any grounding. So you could be like less anti-realist if you thought that there really was objective metaphysical explanation that supported grounding talk, but there wasn't in fact any grounding. That's not my claim, because I think that we should also think of metaphysical explanation in this kind of subjectively constrained way, which amounts to a kind of anti-realism about metaphysical explanation because it makes it mind dependent as opposed to mind independent. Okay, and then just the final point is that, in case it's not clear, my claim here has been that by talking in terms of grounding, we're able to project a kind of generic metaphysical structure onto reality, which serves all these kind of useful purposes that I mentioned, but that is a projection of something that involves us onto reality rather than something that we discover in mind-independent reality itself, which would be the kind of more realist way of thinking about this. Okay, I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for this wonderful talk. I'm sure that we all have some questions, but if we agreed, we're going to take, is 1 minute okay, Naomi?
1 minute is perfect, yeah.
Okay. We're going to take some water. We're going to, rest a bit, and we'll be back in exactly 60 seconds. And please
Great.
raise your fictional hands to note you in the questions. Okay, we will see each other in 60 seconds from now. I think 1 minute passed, I hope. Okay, well, thank you again, Naomi. Let's start with a question. I think that Edward was the first hand. Please, Edward, tell us your question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I was wondering whether there is any particular reason to hold a sort of anti-realism about grounding here that wouldn't apply to other explanatory relation. So it seems to me that a lot of the worries that you mentioned related to grounding and explanation, for example, would apply to causation as well. And it seems to me that if we are gonna be anti-realist about grounding, then maybe we have the same grounds to be about anti-realist about causation as well. So I was wondering, and not only causation, basically any other explanatory relation or metaphysical sort of explanatory relation that you want to be a realist about. So I was wondering what are your thoughts on causation, whether you would say the same about causation, and if not, what is particular about grounding here?
Yeah, thanks. So I do think it's kind of, well, so two things to say. One is that I'm not sort of really against anti-realism about causation either. But the other thing to say is that I think that's a harder sell because it does seem as though we are at least kind of more able to get some sort of empirical evidence of causation in a way that we're not able to get empirical evidence of grounding. So, you know, I don't think we can get evidence of like precisely how to think about causation, but it looks as though, you know, we have some kind of experience of cause and effect in a way that we lack kind of experience of grounding. So that's kind of one way that you might drive a wedge between those two things, I think. And that goes for some more relations as well. So it seems like, for example, I mean, this is kind of in some ways a silly example, but we know what it is to kind of start with a whole and to chop it up into parts, right? And you might think that that suffices for some kind of understanding of like composition, say. But then if you think that that grounding is something more than that, right? It doesn't seem what evidence you could get that was kind of extra, that would be evidence for grounding over and above the kind of evidence that you might claim for those kind of other kinds of relations.
Can I have a follow-up?
It's a finger.
Yeah, yes. So is the motivation then that like, so I'm thinking about like metaphysics of mind, for example, and a lot of people in that are at least old-fashioned physicalists would say that we have some sort of empirical evidence for mind-brain identity. So one of the classic motivations for mind-brain identity, which entails like supervenience and other sort of metaphysical relation, is that is the best explanation of the correlations that we observe between brain states and, mental states and brain states. So there is a sense in which you can also make the case for some sort of empirical evidence in favor of supervenience, grounding, and even identity. So for example, would you say the same about identity?
So I think one thing that so there's this kind of discussion between people who think that grounding is something. So suppose that we grant that there are these kind of other kinds of dependence relations, maybe we can include identity in those. And you might think that that the kind of work is that the work that's being done there is being done by those kind of finer grained dependence relations. And then there's a question like, is there also grounding, right? And so people like Jessica Wilson have said, you know, there's no work for grounding to do over and above the things that the kind of work that's being done by those other kinds of relations. And so I want to kind of piggyback to some extent on the back of those kinds of arguments, because it looks as though, you know, if we can give an account of that work in terms of the finer grained dependence relations, then, you know, that kind of casts some suspicion on there also like being kind of real grounding, but it doesn't, I think, affect, or, you know, it doesn't cast too much suspicion on the claim that there's useful work for grounding talk to do, right? Because it gives us this kind of level of generality and all that kind of stuff. So I think that that, you know, it's a fine line to tread, but I think that there's an argument to be made that says that we can help ourselves to this kind of useful talk without committing ourselves to the existence of this relation. And if we can avoid that kind of commitment, then, you know, that seems kind of like a good thing to do, because in general, we don't want to sort of overcommit ourselves. So that would be the kind of line. But I grant that, you know, it's a bit of a tricky one to tread. And I do worry about this kind of like overgeneralization into the causation case, if I'm being perfectly honest. So yeah, it's something I want to think a little bit more carefully about. So thanks.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that talk. That was awesome. And now I see why you mentioned metaethics at the beginning. So I have a few questions. I guess I'll just do one and then I'll try to jump back on Stack. The first question that I had was about the fictionalism part, and this is kind of, I feel maybe this is a kind of minor point. But in the so first I have some like I don't know if you've ever read Donna Olson's worries about fictionalism, about Joyce's fictionalism and metaethics.
Yeah, not for a while, but yeah, maybe a long time
But
ago.
I guess I kind of share the worries that first that you're asked to be in these kind of two different states in which like you have the fictional, like you're in the fictional mode and then you're talking in this kind of useful talk kind of way, but when you step out of it, then you recognize that thing for which that talk is useful for. So first, that there's some tension between being in those two states, and second, a worry that I have is, why couldn't we just talk about the other thing? Why do we need to talk about grounding? And in the moral case, I feel like I can have a little bit more of a grip about why, like, look, we can't help but do the moral talk. We need the oomph to get people to do the things that would be useful for the species to do, or something like that. But I was curious about in the grounding case, what is that extra thing that grounding affords that metaphysical explanation couldn't?
Yeah, so yeah,
question.
yeah, thanks. So I think that those are really good worries. I think the answer is that like we've come to this position where we've got this notion that is, you know, useful for doing metaphysics. So my claim, so in part, it seems as though, sorry, there are screaming children, I hope you can't hear. So in part, sorry.
If you need to take a minute, don't worry.
No, it's fine. No, yeah, hopefully they are with their dad. He's just yeah. Yeah, so we've come to this point now where people do, as a matter of fact, talk a lot in terms of grounding. So part of what motivates, you know, the thought that we should continue to do that is that, you know, we don't want to do this kind of wholesale like reinterpreting of everything that everybody said about grounding, and think of it instead in terms of like systems of metaphysical explanation and the relations that give rise to that, even if in fact we could do that, right? So that's one thing to say. So it might be that had things developed differently, we wouldn't have developed this kind of grounding locutions, and that might be okay. So my claim is not that grounding talk is like indispensable. So I'd be happy to lean partly on the fact that it does, as a matter of fact, do this kind of work. But if we were to talk in that way about local dependence relations and about assimilating them into a system of generic explanation which has these kind of mind dependent features, it does seem as though we would firstly add a great deal of complexity. So grounding talk is simplifying, and that seems like a positive. And also it in order to kind of use this tool to do metaphysics, people it matters to people that this talk has this kind of air of objectivity, that I mentioned this very briefly. So I think that there's a sense in which that's wrong, because, you know, as I said, I think we should think of it as this kind of projection of something that includes these kind of subjectively constrained ideas about explanation. But in order to kind of do this work, which I nevertheless think is useful, it seems to matter that we're able to talk about grounding as though it were this kind of more objective thing. And for that, we require grounding talk rather than talking directly in terms of explanation. And then the final thing to say is that, so I kind of have this story about, so grounding talk is kind of semi-technical, right? In the sense that it takes something from this kind of like folk notion of what's going on when we think about something holding in virtue of something else. I think we can account for that in terms of this kind of explanation stuff. But then philosophers have come along and they've kind of developed this like carefully regimented this notion in a way that works for them, like it does the thing that they want it to do. And so we would kind of lose all of that if we stopped talking in terms of grounding. So even though I want to give even though I want to give an account which you know, denies that we should be realists about this thing, you know, I do think that there is a useful role for this talk to play, but it is a really difficult kind of balancing act, because you're exactly right that, you know, you have to sort of tread this really kind of difficult tightrope.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right, Diego?
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. So I mean, I'm not a pro-grounding person exactly, but I wonder sort of what would happen with the objectivity of metaphysics once you like introduce these accounts of what grounding is, right? So the word is just because most metaphysicians want to say that, you know, metaphysics is objective, and as opposed to, you know, how let's say we're doing like epistemology and we want to explain how we know things. If we're doing metaphysics, we want to explain how the world is. So it's just part of metaphysics that we're talking about how the world is and not how we apprehend it or something like that, or at least that's the pretension, right? Or at least some people conceive metaphysics like that, right? So I wonder, sort of, once we have these anti-realist accounts of grounding, if we should, you know, say something else about metaphysics, or if we should just embrace the fact that, you know, metaphysics is not as objective as we thought it would be, or I don't know exactly what you have to say about that. So I guess that's my question.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it depends, you know, to what extent you conceive of metaphysics like in terms of grounding. So the first thing to say is that if you're anti-realist about the relation between, say, two facts, that doesn't make you anti-realist about either of them facts themselves necessarily, right? So you might think that those facts are kind of, you know, out there, and then what we're denying is just that the relation between them is as people have suggested. So I don't think that you at least automatically get a kind of collapse and, like, you know, a kind of wholesale global anti-realism or anything like that. I don't think that follows. If you think about the task of metaphysics as stating what grounds what or something like that, then there's a sense in which that gives you a kind of, you know, more anti-realist picture of metaphysics, because it looks as though, you know, what you're doing is not describing relations between things, but rather giving a kind of projected account of the connection between those kinds of things. Yeah, I think that that's okay. Like I don't feel that as too much of a threat, because I don't think that it means, you know, it's I don't think that there's a threat of like idealism or something like that on the basis of this. But yeah, thanks. It's a good thought.
I'm gonna use my chair privilege to put myself in the queue. So I have two questions, but okay, I'm gonna ask this one. So how are we supposed to make sense of metaphysical disagreements in general? Because so the realist has a nice story, you know, so like someone got it right. So especially if one claim is directly negating the other one, so that's an objective part of the matter. But if we are anti-realists about grounding, then at least some of the disagreements that are phrased in grounding terms will be, in a sense, like people talking past each other. So I'm curious about, so what happened, for instance, in a major discussion about like levels of fundamentality, that someone says A grounds B and the other one says no, B grounds A.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So what I think happens is, so when someone says A grounds B, right, they think that that A is like A explains B, right? So like A is explanatorily responsible for B. The other person thinks that B is the thing that explains A, right? And they each have reasons for thinking that the explanation goes in the direction that they take it to go in. They're going to have those reasons probably on the basis of their kind of background commitments, like the kind of theories that they adhere to more generally. So I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but you know, well, suppose you've got a debate between, like, think about the debate between you know, Schaffer in his priority monism paper. So he says the whole grounds the parts. And you know, someone else like a priority pluralist who says the parts ground the whole, right? So the reason that they're going to have for having those competing views are going to come down more generally to the way that they conceive of like theories in other areas. So it might be that the priority monist thinks that you know, holism thinks that like quantum mechanics gives us evidence for holism or something like that, whereas the priority pluralist might say, you know, might deny that. And so the dispute is going to come down to a broader theoretical dispute, right? And so I don't think that we have to say that people are talking past each other, because we can just understand the disagreement in terms of a disagreement between two competing theories, and we can settle it by thinking about our arguments in general for and against those theories. So so I don't think that we have to say that you know, I don't think that we lose the sense in which people are really arguing about something when they argue about, you know, if we deny realism about grounding, I think we can maintain that there's a substantive disagreement, but we can understand it in terms of participants' commitments to their kind of philosophical theories more generally, and we can settle the disputes by arguing about those theories like we're used to doing.
Just many fingers. So if I understood you correctly, so that this agreement will be translated into like some theories competing, but would the world be the one setting or settling the disagreement, or at the end it would be like a fight between the subjective powers or the subjective values of each theory? So that's
yeah,
does
good. So firstly, I'm not saying that we have to kind of translate it at all. Like, I think we can have the dispute in terms of grounding, but the thing that's kind of making each participant, you know, stick to their guns has to do with how they think about what explains what, which comes down to the kind of theory that they have more generally of the world. Which is the right theory may well be settled by the world. So I mean, I'm inclined to think that theory choice is also something that's sort of subjectively constrained. So I want to be like a little bit careful, but certainly we're going to want to say that, you know, the world is doing some work here, right? So it's, you know, it is either true that, you know, you know, some systems have holistic properties, or it's not true, right? And that comes down to how the world is. But like, given that we don't, you know, given that our understanding of the world is imperfect, it's reasonable to hold each of these positions given our other commitments. And so that means we can kind of have this debate. And so we can think that, you know, it can be ultimately settled by the world. Absolutely. Yeah, so I'm not claiming this kind of like, yeah, I don't think that this leads to a sort of really radical anti-realism or anything like that.
actually sorry.
Actually, Leo, can you go first? Because I had a question that was similar to Vida's, so I'm going to think about Naomi's answer.
Okay. So this is just a clarificatory question. So in the second alternative, the grounding is fictional alternative, you glossed it as A grounds B. Just when you say A grounds B, that's strictly false. But what you're expressing, or the information that you're like transmitting, is that the world is in a condition such that the fact that A is explanatory with respect to the fact that B. And so I guess I have trouble understanding that sentence, or there's some candidates. So the first thing that I think is just that that's a global property, right? So this is sort of reminiscent of humanism. When you say that P is a law, for example, you're not making reference to the fact that P, exactly, you're saying something like, well, I mean, I don't know how like widespread this like humanism thing is, but basically they think that the world is just a bunch of facts and they're organized in such a way that P is a good summary of like those facts or something like that. So it's like a global property, right? So it depends on, so it depends not only on the fact that P, it just depends on other things being the case or something like that. So I wonder if in the grounding is fictional alternative, that's also happening. And when you say the world is in a condition such that A is explanatory with respect to B, if you talk about facts, for example, you need the fact that A and you need the fact that B, but you also need some other facts that sort of make it the case, or unrelated facts that make it the case that the fact that A is explanatory with respect to the fact that B, or is that not the way to understand it?
Yeah, so I guess that's not really quite the way that I was thinking about it. What I was thinking is that what's like conveyed when a speaker says that A grounds B, or that the fact that A grounds the fact that B, is that, you know, they take B to be explained in terms of A. They take A to be explanatory with respect to B. And then there's talk about the facts, and then there's a question about like, okay, but what, like, how does that get to be the case? Like, what supports, why is it that they take A to be explanatory with respect to B, for example? And there I think there's this kind of picture of explanation that says that we require some kind of dependence relation. So maybe it's like, composition or something like that. And also these kinds of subjective constraints on explanation that I mentioned before. So they kind of understand this thing on the basis of that thing and that kind of thing. And then my thought was that that what the speaker does is kind of tells us about something about their sort of system of explanation. So their kind of general way of understanding the world as kind of fitting together in a kind of global way. And so there are subjective constraints on that thing, but there is also some work for the world to do in the way that I was thinking about it. So again, I wasn't suggesting that we should be sort of anti-realist about those facts necessarily. It's only about the kind of connection between those facts. Does that help? Cool, thanks.
So I guess we have time for one more question. Nurit had the hand first, if you still want to ask your question.
I do. I'll be super quick. So I guess I was wondering the response to Byron, and also something that you said to me. I was wondering what you would think of a picture like this, in which what lends grounding its flavor of objectivity is that what it's useful for, or if one has like a more reductive view, what it reduces to, but I get the worries about having the kind of reductive view, is that the context in which we talk about grounding are contexts where what would settle, like when you were talking to Pyro about the what would settle which theory is right, etc., are shared. So that's where we get the feeling of objectivity. There is a fact of the matter of which of us is right about grounding or about explanation, because those are cases in which our pragmatic concerns, epistemic concerns, etc., are sufficiently aligned so that there actually is a fact of the matter with respect to what we care about. So it's still mind dependent, it's still subjective in a series of senses, but we get the feeling of objectivity because there is this fact of the matter with respect to our different subjective aims. And yeah, I don't know if you think that would make sense, because I was thinking that, that's just the question, sorry.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, I guess I was thinking that the air of objectivity comes from, from talking about this relation that we don't kind of think of as being subject to the kind of subjective constraints that we think that there are on explanation. But then when it comes to disagreeing, so I mean, people disagree about what grounds what, right? So it's like having disagreement is fine. We just have to be able to like give an account of that disagreement such that, yeah, it's not just kind of like, it's not, you know, we can't just say, well, you know, A grounds B for you and B grounds A for me or something like that. And the reason that we wouldn't be happy with that is because, like, as I was kind of trying to say to Pyro, you know, we care deeply about these kinds of more general metaphysical theories that we subscribe to. Like, we think someone's right and someone else is wrong. So we might be able to grant, like, yeah, sure, if you believe the stuff that you believe about, you know, whatever the, you know, quantum mechanics say, then you might think that B grounds A, but I don't believe that, so I believe that A grounds B. But we're not happy to just leave it there, because we're using this kind of disagreement about grounding to get at a, you know, a substantive disagreement about what the world is like.
I think we're at time, so yeah.
Okay.
But thank you for your response.
Thanks.
Being amazing. This has been a very, very, very productive way of spending 1 hour with a 30 minutes amazing talk and 30 minutes of discussion. Thank you, Naomi, for this hour. It's been really cool. I think that the format works of 1 hour. Please join me in one session of virtual claps to
Thanks very much. That was really great, great questions, really. Yeah, thanks a lot for your help. Also, feel free to drop me an email if I, you know, didn't respond to anybody sufficiently. I'm really happy to chat about this stuff another time, so just yeah, get in touch. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Naomi, again, and we'll speak about the next conference.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot. Take care.
That's all right.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bueno, gracias a todos por todos los asistentes a esta primera sesión de los single sessions de Teorema. Nos vemos en la siguiente sesión.